Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolivar y Ponte Palacios y Blanco, a long name for a man whose ambitions would stretch far beyond his time. To the Spanish Empire, he was a rebel, a traitor, a dangerous dreamer. But to the people of South America, he became something much more, a liberator. Born in Caracas, the capital of the Captaincy General of Venezuela, on July 24, 1783, Simón Bolívar entered the world with every privilege that could be afforded to a Creole child of his status. The Bolivar family was among the wealthiest and most respected in all of Spanish America. From the very beginning, Simon's life seemed destined for greatness. Yet behind the wealth and comfort, there was loss. His father died when Simón was still a boy, and his mother soon after. The young Bolivar grew up separated from his siblings, raised mostly by tutors and guardians who could not fill the emotional void left by his parents. His early education was decent, though his teachers often described him as restless and rebellious. He was fascinated by the world beyond Caracas, and he questioned the authority of the Spanish crown that ruled his homeland. Even as a boy, he felt that Venezuela was something more than a distant province of a European empire. By the late 1790s, his interest in independence had already begun to form, and this curiosity soon pushed him into dangerous territory in Daingao. 1797, young Simón became involved with underground movements that whispered of freedom and separation from Spain. He was only a teenager, but his enthusiasm and outspokenness made him a target for the authorities. To avoid serious trouble, his family sent him into exile. Following his uncle Esteban Palacios y Blanco, he sailed to Madrid, where he would spend the next few years expanding his education and his worldview. Europe changed him. In Madrid, Bolívar witnessed a culture of refinement and political complexity that was far removed from the rigid colonial society of Venezuela. But it was Paris that would truly awaken his revolutionary spirit. When his uncle became entangled in political turmoil, Bolívar was briefly forced into exile again, wandering through Bilbao and Paris, before finally being allowed to return to Madrid. For a time, he lived the life of a wealthy young nobleman traveling through Europe and attending salons where the ideas of the Enlightenment filled the air. It was during these years that he was introduced to the philosophies of liberty, equality, and national sovereignty. These were dangerous ideas for a Spanish subject, but they would come to define the rest of his life. By 1803, Simón had returned to Europe, once more traveling through Madrid and then back to Paris. It was there that he began to discuss openly with friends and thinkers the possibility of freedom not just for Venezuela, but for all of Spanish America. Yet in the midst of these dreams, another figure had risen across Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Bolívar admired the energy and brilliance of Napoleon, but despised his ambition for tyranny. At first, the young Venezuelan saw in Napoleon a model of the self-made man who could reshape nations, but when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, Bolivar's admiration turned to disgust. He saw that absolute power corrupted even those who claimed to fight for liberty. In 1805, Bolivar left Paris for Italy, where he traveled, through Milan, Venice, Florence, and finally, Rome. There he stood on the Monte Sacro hill and made a vow to himself and to the heavens. He would not rest until he had freed Spanish America from the chains of European domination, even if it cost him his life. It was a promise that would drive him for the next quarter of a century. Returning home was not easy. Europe was engulfed in wars between France, Spain, and Britain, and sea travel was perilous. It took until late 1806 for Bolívar to secure passage back to the Americas on an American ship sailing out of Germany. He landed in Charleston, South Carolina, and spent months traveling through the eastern United States, fascinated by the nation that had achieved what he dreamed of. He studied its system of government, its values, and its commitment to independence. These observations would later influence his own ideas for governing a free Latin America. After a year abroad, Bolívar finally returned to Caracas. His homeland, however, was not the same. The political winds had shifted, and the ideas of freedom that had once been whispered in secret were now being shouted in the streets. Yet not everyone agreed on what independence meant. Many of the Creole elite shared Bolívar's frustrations with Spain, but feared losing their social status. They wanted reform, not revolution. Bolívar stood apart. He was seen as radical, even reckless. Then everything changed in 1808. Napoleon invaded Spain and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. Across the Spanish world, the legitimacy of authority crumbled. In Caracas, loyalty split. Many Creoles rejected Napoleon's rule, but rather than submit to a French king, they decided to govern themselves in the name of the rightful monarch Ferdinand VII. What began as loyalty to a distant king soon became the first spark of independence. In 1810, the tension exploded. The people of Caracas demanded a new government. When Captain General Vicente Emparan stepped onto his balcony to address the crowd, he asked if they still wanted him to rule. The crowd shouted no. That moment marked the end of Spanish authority in Venezuela and the birth of the Supreme Junta of Caracas. Though it claimed to govern in Ferdinand's name, it was in truth a declaration of autonomy. Bolivar joined the movement with full force. He traveled to London on a diplomatic mission seeking support from Great Britain for the cause of Venezuelan independence. While he did not secure official aid, he succeeded in convincing the famed revolutionary Francisco de Miranda to return home and join the struggle. Together, they worked to organize the new government and rally the provinces, but unity proved fleeting. Rivalries among the Creole elites and opposition from loyalists soon fractured the movement. Still, on July 5, 1811, the Congress of Venezuela officially declared full independence from Spain. It was a bold act of defiance that would plunge the region into years of war. The First Republic of Venezuela was born under constant threat. Royalist forces soon counterattacked. Natural disasters like the devastating Caracas earthquake of 1812 weakened the republic further. Many saw the quake as divine punishment for rebellion. Miranda was captured and handed over to the Spanish, and Bolivar once again was forced into exile. But this time he would not give up. Fleeing to New Granada, Bolivar began to gather new forces and write passionate manifestos calling for total independence. His rhetoric grew fiercer. He declared that all Spaniards who opposed liberty must be expelled or destroyed. It was a brutal but decisive stance for a brutal time. In 1813, he led the admirable campaign sweeping across western Venezuela and liberating city after city. When he re-entered Caracas in triumph, the people hailed him as El Libertador, the Liberator. The Second Republic of Venezuela was born with Bolivar as its leader. Yet again, divisions tore it apart. Civil war erupted between royalists, federalists, and revolutionaries. Within a year, Bolivar was forced to flee once more as Spanish forces regained control. He escaped to New Granada and continued to fight this time on behalf of his neighbors. When New Granada too began to fall, Bolivar found himself adrift in the Caribbean, moving from one island to another. In 1815, he settled briefly in Jamaica, where he wrote the famous Letter from Jamaica, a visionary document that outlined his dream of a united and independent Latin America. He predicted the future of nations that did not yet exist and warned of the dangers of division and tyranny. It was during this exile that he met Renato Beluche, a Venezuelan sailor who convinced him to travel to Haiti. There, Bolivar met President Alexandre Pétion, who offered him refuge weapons and ships on one condition. If Bolivar ever regained Venezuela, he must abolish slavery. Bolivar agreed without hesitation. With Haitian support, Bolivar returned to the mainland in 1816, launching new campaigns that would slowly shift the tide of the wars. By 1819, his forces had achieved their greatest victory. Crossing the treacherous Andes Mountains during the rainy season, Bolivar surprised the Spanish army and liberated New Granada. Out of this triumph, he created a new state, Gran Colombia, a union of Venezuela, New Granada, and later Ecuador. For the first time, his dream of a united South America seemed within reach. But the struggle was far from over. The wars of independence raged across the continent, and Bolivar now turned his attention to the south. In Peru, he fought to drive out the last remnants of Spanish power, and in 1825, the Republic of Bolivia was founded in his honor. Across the continent, cities and nations celebrated him as the liberator, the man who had freed an empire. Yet even as he stood at the height of his power, Bolivar saw the cracks forming beneath his feet. The same divisions that had haunted Venezuela now spread through Gran Colombia. Regional rivalries, corruption, and political ambition began to tear his creation apart. Bolivar's dream of unity was collapsing into civil war. He tried to hold the fragile union together, ruling at times as a dictator to maintain order. But his authority was constantly challenged. Many who once called him hero now called him tyrant. Disillusioned and weary, he lamented that those who had fought for liberty were ungovernable and that he had plowed the sea. By 1830, his health was failing. He resigned from the presidency of Gran Colombia and prepared to leave for exile in Europe, but he never made it. On December 17, 1830, Simón Bolívar died of tuberculosis in Santa Marta at the age of 47.